Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Asset Management Standard and Landscape 2024 Updates. My name is Rain, and I'm delighted to be your host for this session, brought to you by Erudite Reliability Services, OPC, and the Asset Management College. This is our fourth webinar this year. If you have missed our previous one, you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel. Before we dive in, let me quickly share what's in store for us today. This webinar is designed to unpack some of the most anticipated updates in asset management standards for 2024, including the new standards introduced by WPIAM, or Certified Asset Management Assessor. We're thrilled to have an esteemed expert joining us to shed light on these developments and their implication for organizations worldwide. Our speaker today is none other than Phil Sunderland from the Asset Management College. He brings 40 years of technical coaching and leadership expertise, primarily in oil gas production, a certified senior practitioner in asset management, CSAM, and certified asset management assessor, He excels in developing and delivering practical training and consulting solutions for asset-intensive industries, has mentored more than 50 professionals to achieve asset management certifications, and specialized in crafting actionable asset management strategies and fostering professional growth through tailored training. Phil certainly brings a wealth of knowledge and practical insights to the table. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Phil Sunderland. Phil, we're glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rain, and thank you to Erudite for both organising this seminar and inviting me to participate and indeed present at the seminar. I've counted as a privilege, and I hope it's the forebear of lots of discussions and increased participation between Australia and the Philippines in the realm of asset management. I know that's a very healthy relationship already. So I'm going to go into a presentation now. Let me just share my screen here. And then I have to reorganize a few things on my own screen. I hope everybody can see that screen there. I'm sure you'll tell me if it's not visible to you. So today we're going to talk about the Asset Management ISO series of standards and also the Global Forum's Asset Management Landscape. Those have all been updated, and we want to talk about them. Let me give you a little bit about our objectives here. What I want to do is provide an efficient overview of the 2024 changes to these asset management series of standards. That's the ISO 5000 series of standards. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And the Global Forum on Maintenance and Asset Managers Asset Management Landscape. So for two things. So you can understand the scope and the key details of these documents, and more particularly, take note of where some of the changes that have been made in 2024, where you might need to make some changes to what you're doing in your organisation with respect to asset management. And of course, the other option here is for anybody who has the Certified Asset Management Assessor accreditation at the moment, or certification, if you'd like to upgrade that to the so-called CAMA 2, taking into account of the new information, you can use this course as a vehicle for doing that, and we'll talk about more of that at the end of the seminar. I'm going to move on now. The topics we're going to cover. We're going to do the introduction and overview, which is happening right now. We'll then go in and look at the updates to the ISO 55000 standard. And then we'll have a few slides on updates to the ISO 55001 standards, and then the landscape updates, and then we'll talk about the CAMA 2. There'll be an opportunity for questions actually all the way through. We'll pause on a few occasions to give an opportunity for discussions and for questions. I hope all that is okay. So, what is all of this about? We have an ISO standard called the ISO 55000. And for those who are familiar with it, this is or are not familiar with, this is the standard that talks about the reason for having an asset management system, what it is to have a management system for asset management, the benefits, and it provides the principles and some of the characteristics and the outcomes that we're looking for from asset management, and more particularly, the implementation of an asset management system. ISO 55001 is the standard where we read all about what we must do to implement a management system for asset management or an asset management system. This document is the one that is auditable. It contains all of the shall statements. The company shall do this. Top management shall do that. So all of the things that we have to do are documented there in ISO 55001. The last document, and the third of the main documents that we're going to talk about today, is the Global Forum's Asset Management Landscape. Now, for those who don't know, the Global Forum in Maintenance and Asset Management, or GFMAM, is an organisation that's made up of a number of member organisations from around the globe, all of them non-profit, all of them about implementing and supporting the implementation of asset management in their own countries and in their own cultures. So those are the three documents that we're talking about. And all three of those documents were reissued in 2024. They were first issued back in 2014, so they're 10 years old, and they've had quite an update. We've had an international team across the globe working for over 2 years in what do we need to do to make this better? What have we learned about asset management over the last 10 years? What do we need to include in the new standards? And so they've been updated significantly. And so all of these learnings have been implemented and included in the 2024 versions of our asset management system documents. What they've achieved, and kudos to the team, congratulations to the team that did all of this work. We've got improved clarity and alignment between all of the documents. There's a whole lot more standards that have been developed that provide guidance on how we should implement ISO 55001. There's about half a dozen, about 6 extra standards now that have been issued or going to soon be issued through 2024 and forthcoming months. In the landscape, the grouping of the subjects has become more logical and a bit more easy to get into, in my opinion. And the descriptions in the subjects have improved even where the intent hasn't changed. There are some big changes in a few areas, and we will do a bit of a deep dive, and look at those today. That's what we're going to cover in particular. Just a little comment is that there's 40 subjects in the asset management landscape and only 27 clauses in the ISO standard 55001. So the scope of the landscape is much greater than that of the standard. And we'll talk about the reasons for that as we go through. Here's a list of all of the standards related to asset management. ISO 55000 is the overview, as we talked about. The requirements are in 55001. 55002 used to be the only standard that provided guidance, but now that you can see there's a few more starting at the 55010. So guidance on the alignment of financial and non-financial, guidance for development of public policy, people involvement, management of data assets, and so on we go. There's another one coming out on decision making. So there's all of those. What we're going to focus on for the remainder of this seminar is the top two plus the landscape. Let me do a real quick technical check here and ask Erudite, is everything coming across okay? Can you hear me okay? Can you see the slides okay? We good? Thumbs up?
Yeah, good.
All good? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, very good. Okay, so let's talk about the updates to 55,000, ISO standard 55,000. Here's an overview of those updates. The first thing, it's been restructured to provide a bit better insight. In the 2014 version of the standard, there were 4 fundamentals described, and those 4 fundamentals are now 3 principles. We call them principles. And although there's few of those, there's also 2 key outcomes and 3 characteristics that are described in the ISO 1000 now. The organisational maturity for asset management has been introduced. And there was a lot of, if you like, duplication between what was in 55,000 and 55,001. And that duplication has been removed. And so some elements have been removed from 55,000. And I just want to use a bit of a picture here. Many of you would be familiar with this picture of the asset management fundamentals from ISO 55,000 2014. The 4 principles being value, alignment, assurance, and leadership, with plan, do, check, act, pinwheel in between. Those 4 principles have moved over now, and we have got 3 principles: leadership, value, and alignment. We'll talk about those again in a moment. And 3 characteristics: adaptability, assurance, and sustainability. So that's just a little bit of a picture before we get deeper into this, to show how the principles from the 2014 version have the fundamentals, the 4 fundamentals from the previous version have become 3 principles and 3 characteristics in our new standard. Let's go through some concepts. Now, we're really going to get the conceptual level and get a bit of an overview of ISO 55,000 here. I'm sure everybody's aware that the reason that we have an asset management system is to help us meet our organisation's objectives. It all starts with, what does our organisation exist to do? What is our organisation's purpose? And what is our organisation's objectives? We need to clearly understand that before we think about how we're going to use the assets of the organisation to help achieve the purpose and the objectives of our organisation. Everything we do in asset management is subservient to and supportive of the organisation's purpose and objectives. Part of the organisation's purpose is to serve its shareholders, and understanding who the shareholders are and understand the context of the organisation, what's the external environment and how is that changing of the organisation, is imperative to understanding how we're going to use our assets over time. The other corner of our framework is, of course, our physical assets and data assets, the assets that we use to provide the value that we're trying to provide out of our organisation. And lastly, the asset management system is one of a number of management systems that you've probably got in your organisation. And the concept of the management system and bringing that to bear on how we manage our assets is key to having an operating asset management system. So within that framework now, let's talk about those principles. The first one, I think most will be familiar with. The key principle in asset management is that our focus is not on the assets so much as it is on the value that the assets provide. Let's understand the value that the organisation is providing to the stakeholders, and then work out how those assets are going to help us provide that value. The next one is leadership. We need to have sustained and broad leadership across the organisation to drive us and to guide us into implementation and use of an effective asset management system. The other thing we need to build into our asset management system is alignment. That's vertical alignment, so that the objectives of the organisation translate down into the objectives in every other part of the organisation, and horizontal alignment, so that all of the different functions in our organisation are all focused on the one value. So these are the three key principles of asset management. When we get it right, the value that we provide can be measured and can be seen in helping us achieving our organisational objectives, and also realising the value that we're trying to realise for the stakeholders. So those are the two key outcomes that are documented in ISO 55000, achieving the organisational objectives and realising values for the stakeholders. The other outcomes are these things that we call characteristics. What does it look like in the organisation when we have a good asset management system? And the first of those is assurance. It gives us a degree of confidence that the value that we're looking to achieve will actually be achieved. Because we are continuing to watch the context of the organisation and thinking about the objectives of the organisation, it's going to make us more adaptable. So that's another characteristic we're going to see of our asset management organisation, asset management system in our organisation. And lastly, because asset management by its very nature is looking at the long term, the life cycle, it leads us to more sustainable outcomes. So sustainability is also a key characteristic. Lastly, I just want to remind you of a couple of other paragraphs that we have already mentioned are coming. That is the recognition that we need to mature our asset management systems over time. It's very difficult to just implement an asset management system in one day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. It's a multi-year maturity journey, and we need to recognise that, understand it, and build it into our plans. The other one is, we talked about having various management systems. We want to integrate our asset management system with our controls, integrity management system, with our safety management system, with our risk management system, and so it goes, so that all of our management systems are integrated and they all are part of how our organisation does its business and delivers value to the stakeholders. In terms of changes to the ISO 55000, the other thing they would like to point out to you is on this next page. And this shows the list of benefits that were shown in the 2014 version of the standard. And in red, there you see sustainability. The reason it's been taken out of this little chart is because, of course, it's now listed as a key characteristic of our asset management system. And I won't go through them all, but on my right there, you can see in green the things that have changed in terms of the benefits listed in ISO 55000 2024. Please note the two down the bottom there, entirely new benefits listed of improved coordination and communication and increased value from innovation. Before we finish talking about ISO 55000, there's just a few more things I'd like to cover. In the 2014 version of the standard, it said that the asset management standard and the ISO standard was really based towards physical assets, but that it could be used for other types of assets. That language has been removed from the 55000 standard now, and instead it's replaced with a language that says that this asset management systems applies to all types of assets in all types of organizations. So there really is no limit to the sorts of assets that we can use for the asset management system or apply the asset management system to. The definitions have been restructured and expanded. We've now defined data and information, and as we'll see later, knowledge as well. We've got additional life cycle definitions. We've got a definition there for sustainability, and there's a definition there for frameworks, which have become more of a significant item in the latest version of the standard. The last one, although in our asset management system, our asset requirement for our asset management policy and the definition of that and the definition of our asset management plans, they are the same, but the definition for the strategic asset management plans, or often called SAMP, the definitions for our SAMP has been updated, and we're going to look at that in more detail on future slides. Now, I've been talking for a few minutes now, and it's time for me to stop and let somebody else have a go. So what I'm going to do is flick over to this next slide and just ask if there's any questions that have come up from the first part of this this seminar.
Yep. All right. So this is our first question and answer interval. For those who have questions, we encourage you to take this chance to ask ahead. You can raise your hand so we can call you, or message in the chat section. While they're waiting, while we are waiting for, okay, so we got a question. Value definition is significant to AM or asset management. How should an organization define the value it gets from the assets?
This very much depends on the types of assets that you have and the customer and clients that you serve. In every training session that I get into on asset management, one of the very first things we start talking about is the value we provide. And for many service organisations, like if you think about a local government that is providing roads and sewerage and green parks and those sorts of things to a community, it's very hard to put a dollar number on that and just describe the value in terms of dollars and cents, or in money terms. What we often have to do is define service levels. And service levels can be a broad range of items. Let me give you some examples. If you're a council and you're providing drinking water to a group of people, you can talk about the volume of water you produce and provide. You can talk about the quality of the water. And there's specifications for drinking water quality. So those two, and you can just talk about the population that you supply. Sometimes you have to talk about the condition. If you're talking about we provide open space to people, then you would talk about the condition of the park and, you know, the fact that you're going to keep it free of debris and rubbish, or you're going to mow the lawn so often. So the service level that you provide, the value that you provide is going to be different for different organisations with different stakeholders. But in every case, it is very important that you get together with the key decision makers in your organisation and define what it is, the service levels that you want to achieve from your assets. It's an important driver for your asset management plans. It's an important driver for everything. Now, I sort of waffled on there a bit. I hope that came close to answering the questions. I can talk more offline about the scope of service levels when it comes to measuring value from assets.
All right, sounds good. So do we have any other questions regarding ISO 55000 in general?
Hi, Philip. Good afternoon.
Hi, Jason.
Hi. I'm just curious. Currently, now our plant, by the way, our plant is a feeds manufacturing plant. We manufacture animal feeds. And currently, in ISO, we only have ISO 9001. I'm just
Mhm.
curious, what does it take, or what warrants ISO 55,000 to be included in one of the ISO standards that we should be considering?
Very good question. You will find that well, let me start by saying this. The requirement for a management system, or the requirements for management systems, are very, very similar across ISO 9000 for quality, 55,000 for assets, 31,000 for risk management, and so on. And in fact, when you compare them, you could say that, oh, do I really need to add anything different to say ISO 9000? There are additional details and additional processes that are defined in ISO 55,000, for example, around the strategic asset management plan, the asset management plan, and the asset management landscape, which we'll talk about in a few minutes' time. Those documents together provide a lot more granularity and a lot more detail about making sure that you're getting the right assets and that you're getting value. So they are very similar to ISO 9000 in the requirements, but they provide a different lens that helps organizations really extract more value out of their assets. So it's a bit more granularity, Jason, is what you mainly get.
All right, thank you.
We have another question from Sir Jefferson first. So what are the possible problems that an organization may encounter when implementing the existing asset management program with the ISO 55,000?
There's the issues that an organization implementing asset management as a new process are the same as in putting in place any new process. You need to start by making sure that the leadership is committed to implementing an asset management system that is aligned with ISO 55001 and the asset management landscape. First things first, get your leadership commitment there, describe the reasons that are there. And then, of course, you've got to define, asset management is data driven. And so you've got to look at your data systems to make sure that they're going to provide you with the right data to be able to implement the system. And then you've got to bring the organization along. And it's beyond the scope of this seminar to go into all of the details around organizational change management. But I would recommend that you read Kotter's Managing Change, I think. Leading Change might be the name of the title. I can give you that in the chat after this seminar has ended. But that actually outlines some of the barriers to organizational change management and gives practical steps as to what you might need to do to drive that change through the organization. But get your leadership on board, work out how you're going to drive the change through the organization, because people and change don't necessarily go hand in hand. And because asset management is highly data driven, it is almost certainly going to require you to look at what data you've got and how you manage it. And you'll probably find some challenges there. I hope that goes somewhere to answering the question.
All right. So did that answer your question, Sir Jefferson? Can you give us a thumbs up? All right, thank you. Next one. Yep, so we're just going to do this two more questions before we continue. Is that all right, Sir Phil? Yep. So first is
Yes,
how
absolutely.
to know the critical assets.
Oh, there are a number of guidelines for doing that. I would suggest that you start by getting a framework for classifying the criticality of your assets. There are a number of options available. I know some organizations that use a star system, a 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, 1-star. Some people talk gold, silver, bronze, but for each time they've got to say, what is the impact on our organization? And it changes for every organization in every context. What are the things that are going to have a really big impact on us? The things that have a lower impact if they're not working right, all the way down to things that will have a trivial impact on the outcomes and the objectives of the organization if they're not working right. And then you put some structure behind that and then get the right team together to go through and look at your assets. And you can end up with some descriptions. There are some good go-bys that are available to organizations. And there's a number of consultants that can help you with that. But it is an important first step is making sure that you've classified your assets right. And I would encourage you in your asset register to record the criticality of the asset against every tag in your asset register. That might take some time. You've got to be careful about how you go through it. But there are good criteria to be used, probably out of the scope of this particular presentation. But there are some good processes to be used. And it all comes back to this, keeping asking the question, if this asset fails to provide its normal service, in what ways is it going to impact the value that this organisation delivers? Is it going to be a big impact on the organisation's value delivery, or a smaller one, or a trivial one? And use that, just keep asking that question to get to the right answer.
All right, so we're just going to do this one more question, but don't fret, later on we still have more of these Q&A sessions moving forward. So the last question for now, with the transition from only physical assets to other types of assets like data or finance, does the ISO 55000 changes also include how to deal with those intangible types of assets?
Okay, there is the guidance on the data and non-data assets. So that's ISO, if I got my numbers correct, my memory's correct, 55010 provides some guidance on how to do that and how to manage those intangible assets. But this is still, I have to say, a developing series of thought. But the reason for the ISO standard in particular saying it's not just physical assets is really around that data asset thing. The fact that all of a sudden now we're recognizing that data and information in itself meets the condition of an asset, that is an item, thing, or entity that provides value to the organization, and thus it requires appropriate management. So I would refer you off to that ISO standard 55010 as a starting point. I hope that answered the question.
So is that good? So if any case you still have questions regarding this, we do you can take note of your questions and ask them again later. Okay,
All
so thanks for that, Phil. I guess we're ready to move for the next session.
All right. So if you remember, now we're talking about ISO 55001 updates. And ISO 55000, if you remember me saying, is where we read the requirements for our asset management system. So I'll just start with an overview, and then we will go into a pictorial representation of the changes, and then we'll get into some more details. So you might hear everything a few times, but I hope that helps to drive home what has actually changed in the standard. First of all, you'll notice now that there are some definitions in ISO 55001. They used to all be in ISO 55000. There are some repeats, but there are also some definitions that are new. There's these new additional sub-clauses or clauses within ISO 55001 about decision-making around the SAMP, planning for changes, and knowledge. We're going to talk more about all of those as we go further through this presentation. And Another big change, particularly in the planning area, is the need to separately but specifically think about the risks to the organisation and the opportunities that the organisation may have. And also, there's a very clear definition now around data and information, and almost every time we read about them, we don't hear about just data or just information, but data and information. Other changes that we've seen, there's an enhanced focus on life cycle management in operations planning and control. Life cycle management, I should say, has always been a focus of the asset management system, but that reference has been strengthened now. The other thing that's been strengthened is what used to just be called the outsourcing clause in the ISO 55001. Now it's not called outsourcing anymore. It's called externally provided processes, products, technology, and services. And just the title gives you a bit of an idea of the expansion in scope of this particular clause. We will go into detail on that. The clause on preventive action has been renamed and extended and talks about predictive action, and we will talk about what predictive action means in the context of asset management. And not obviously, but there is additional emphasis on the critical role of leadership for the successful use of an asset management system. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to look at pictures to help me understand how things have changed and to learn new facts. So although this is still just words, this is the ISO, now can you see my screen? This is the 2014 clauses that were in the standard, and you can see them lay out across from that basically green colour for plan, in blue do, and yellow check, and in red act. So the whole of the ISO standard is built around this plan, do, check, act. And you can see all of the clauses there. I'm not going to read them all out, but these were all of the clauses in the old version of the standard. Let's look at what it looks like now. In 2024, these are the clauses. You can see it's very similar in the layout, but then let's look at what's new and what's changed. There's a new clause on decision-making that has been added in the context area. There's a new clause in planning that talks about specifically about planning for risks and opportunities, as I foreshadowed on the previous slide. There is a more expansive discussion about the SAMP in the asset management objectives and plans to achieve them. And the management of change has been split into planning for change and control of the change. It used to all be in 8 operation. In the support area, what used to be called the information clause is now data and information. And a new clause has been added on knowledge and knowledge management. In the operations area, in operations planning and control, there's this additional emphasis on life cycle management. In operation, what was management of change is now called control of change, and it is very much tied to the planning of changes that we had over here in clause 6. And there's that clause on outsourcing that has had its name expanded significantly, externally provided process, products, technology, and services. Right over here on the far right in the continuous improvement clause, this preventive action has changed to predictive action. I think that's the last of the changes that we're going to see. So I'm going to use this visual cue as we go through the changes to the ISO standard. So the first one I'm going to refer to, and I'm not sure whether you'll see it on your screens, but there's a yellow highlight around this decision-making framework. So let's talk about that for a moment. In asset management decision-making, there's now a requirement to have a decision-making framework, and that framework should define the desired value and help you to understand the criteria to use in decision-making to achieve that value. And your decision-making criteria to include all of these things: the time period, the potential impact, complexity, regulatory requirements, urgency, all sorts of things. And then what are the methods and the processes and the tools we're going to do to evaluate the options and to deliver the right decisions? And how do we govern that? How do we provide governance to the decision-making process? So there's not, as is typical for an ISO 50, an ISO standard, and a management system standard, it doesn't say how to do it. It just says that you need to do it. And so every organization that I interface with, we start by saying, well, what tools do you have? What decision-making guidelines do you have now? Let's start to bring them together and say, well, what's missing? What do we need to develop? How do they fit together? And we will talk about decision-making again when we're looking at the landscape. The landscape also has a subject on decision-making that is a little bit different in context and focus to the ISO standard, but it adds value, and we'll talk about that when we get there. I'm going to move on now to, if you'll excuse me, this clause on planning where it talks about risks and opportunities. So a little bit more detail on that now. First of all, the definition. I think most people know that the definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, but also now we have a definition on opportunity, which is a circumstance or set of circumstances that we can be exploited to make things better, to improve performance, exceed our objectives, basically, or more objectives, additional objectives, but to drive continuous improvement. And just whilst we can't predict the future, and that might result in events that provide risk, that is a downward force on our objectives and the achievement of the objectives, so too the future may bring to us opportunities, and we need to be ready to identify those opportunities, make use of them, and decide which ones we want to take advantage of to deliver more value from our assets. So in ISO 55001 2024, this year's version, it has separate but somewhat similar clauses that say you need to identify and manage your risks, and then you need and put processes in place to continue to identify and manage risks, and also put processes in place to identify and continue to identify forthcoming opportunities and which ones you're going to take advantage of. All right. So that's the next main topic we wanted to talk to there. Oops. Now we're talking about asset management objectives and our plans to achieve those objectives here. We used to have a definition of the strategic asset management plan that you can see on your screens here. And that updated definition also is on your screen there. I don't plan to just read it to you. It's there and it's in the standard. Notice that all of these definitions commence with word documented information. Your asset management plans, your strategic asset management, your plan, your policy, all of your artifacts associated with asset management need to be documented information. That is, they're written down either online or on paper. Somehow or another, they're recorded and they're controlled and available to the organisation. That's what we mean when we say documented information. A little bit more on the strategic asset management plan. It's gone from a simple sentence in the previous version of the standard to a larger clause now in the planning section of the new standard. And it says that there's all sorts of attributes of the SAMP that are described and required, but in terms of consistency with other documents, it needs to include the decision-making framework and definition of value, and talks about how we achieve our define and achieve our asset management objectives, and so on. there's still a recognition that your strategic asset management plan might not all be in one document. It might be shared across a lot of different documents. It might be included in your organizational strategy. It doesn't have to be in a document that's separately titled SAMP, just so long as all of the requirements of the SAMP per the ISO standard are included in whatever document it is that you're using. Let's move on. Now we're going to talk about both planning of change and control of change. These one clause in section 6 on planning, one clause in section 8 on operation. And it says that all parent changes need to be carried out in a planned manner, and you need to assess the risks. These are very similar to what was in the previous version of the standard, except additional emphasis now on making sure that you plan for your changes. And then the clause in 8.2 is just the same clause or the same section of a clause that used to be in the 2014 version that says control the change. You need to be in control of what's happening. Data and information and knowledge. We're going to talk about those now, these changed and added clauses at the end of section 7 on support. Let's start with some definitions. Data are just facts about an object, and an object can be anything, physical or non-physical. So data. Information is data with context. So it's data that has meaning and that you're able to make decisions on this. So it's not just a number like a flow of 10 litres per minute. It's data in context, like this is 10 litres per minute and the design rate for this particular pump is 8 litres per minute. So we're over our design flow. We need to do something about changing and reducing our design flow, or either that or understand the impact that it's going to have on the life of that pump. Knowledge is another thing again. Knowledge is having the implicit knowledge about how to get things done. Knowledge is something that humans have and that humans can write down. And it's more than just data. It's more than just information about that data for decision making. It's how to make the decisions. It's knowing who to talk to. It's knowing about what relationships are important. It's knowing about the experiences that we've had before, that if we do this, we get the wrong result. And if we do that, we get the right result. That is knowledge. And the new clause requires that we have some management systems there, as we'll see on this next page. So clause 7.6 refers to data and information, similar to what was in 2014. And so now you're required as an organisation to understand what knowledge do you need to have in place to run the asset management system. You need to put processes in place to manage that knowledge. For example, how you use the available knowledge, how do you make sure that it's shared and available to people when needed, and how do you retain that knowledge, particularly as people move in and out of the organisations, as processes changed? Where do you store the knowledge in a way that makes it accessible to people? Or more particularly, also, how do you make sure that people who are working and have developed knowledge in the organisation share that and make that knowledge well known for the organisation, so when they move on to another position, that knowledge is still there to help the organisation run its business. The other thing we need to do is continue to acquire new knowledge. So there's a new requirement in the standard now for knowledge management. And again, you see a similar clause and a similar requirement in the asset management landscape. We won't need to talk about knowledge again, but it is there in the landscape as well. Almost getting towards the end of 55,001 changes. Let's just talk about outsourcing or this externally provided everything. So the clause has been expanded. The requirement is similar, except that the number of clauses that you need to comply with in ISO 55001 when you outsource some activity or some technology or some product, whatever that you're outsourcing. It's all of Chapter 7 on support, which includes communication and competency and all those sorts of things. All of Clause 8 on operation and 9.1 on measurement, assessment and evaluation. And it needs to be aligned with the SAMPs and AMPs per Clause 6.2. The key thing here is that the scope and depth of the requirements for outsourcing, how you manage outsourced activities has been expanded in the 2024 version of the ISO standard. The owner of the asset retains accountability for the asset and the outcomes, even when they've outsourced any sort of the activities associated with managing that asset. Last topic here now on ISO 55001, before I take another rest and have some more questions, is this thing called predictive maintenance. Now, what is predictive maintenance? Predictive action. What is this thing called predictive action? Let me show you this little diagram in the bottom right-hand corner here to help you understand it. If I'm measuring something, let's say I'm measuring the vibration of a bearing, and I measure that on an ongoing basis every now and then. And eventually I find that the bearing is starting to degrade and the vibration is going up. Now, at this point here, I say I need to take action to replace this bearing before it fails. If I do nothing, by the time I get to this point, the bearing will have failed. I've had a functional failure. So here's my warning time. And what I'm trying to do by measuring this parameter, this vibration in this sense, is try and predict, by watching as it increases, trying to predict where this point is so that I can do my maintenance or repair or whatever I need to do prior to the failure. Now, that's just one example. But there's a whole suite of things that we can need to do to continue to look at repair and replacement options. If you think about a large structure like a bridge, sometimes bridges, they start to degrade depending what they're made of, particularly if, for instance, if the concrete that it was made of was not very strong and it's slowly degrading and corroding over time. Maybe the reinforcement wasn't as good and it's starting to develop cracks and it's going down. What predictive action is about monitoring that bridge and saying, okay, we've got a 1 year, 2 year, 5 years left of life of that bridge before we have to replace it. So let's start putting in the budget now the costs we need to replace that bridge. So there's another example of predictive action. And the clause in the ISO standard says that an organisation shall have put predictive action in place. That is, you'll identify the things that you're going to monitor, whether it's the inspection of the bridge, whether it's the vibration on this, whether it's the flow rate on that, whatever it is, the parameters that you're going to continue to monitor to give you the information you need to be able to say, oh, look, we're going to have to replace or repair this at this point in time so that we can input it into the planning process and we can do all of our work on a planned, scheduled basis, which is far more efficient than having the bridge fall over and us having to scramble to repair it, or having the bearing fail and having to scramble to repair it. So that's the point of predictive action. So now it's time again for me to stop and say, do we have any questions?
All right, any questions from our audience? You can raise your hand, open your microphones, or put it on the chat section. While waiting, if there are any, we did have some questions on registration that might apply to this. So first one is, how would you go about developing a decision-making framework?
That's a good question. We are at the early days of talking about decision-making frameworks, or at least I am, and I haven't yet seen a complete decision-making framework for an organization. But my encouragement is this: start with what you have. Sit down and work out what decision-making guidelines do you already have relative to the assets. You might have a defined repair, replace decision tree. You might have a defined way of working out whether something's going to break into your weekly schedule or not. You might have a defined way of working out how you're going to choose between options when you're implementing an asset and looking at life cycles and so on. Or you might have a defined life cycle evaluation program. Whatever you already use, start to bring that together and say, now, how do all of these fit together to give me a good decision-making process for my organization? And as you do that, you're going to start to find, oh, there's gaps here. There's guidance and decision-making guidance we should have with respect to our maintenance program that's not in place. Well, let's make a plan to establish that and get it in place. You might find that you're not strong enough in your decision-making process back at the strategic area when you're deciding on which assets to procure or build. And so that might be something you need to work on. But so to start with, you're building your framework, sit down and document and get the right people to think about all of the decision-making guidelines you currently have in your organization. How do they fit together related to assets? And then where are the gaps and what do we need to do to fill those gaps? That's how I would start.
Right. So we also have a question from Naldi. So 2 questions from Naldi are, what does the standard say about asset obsolescence? Obsolescence, and
Yes.
how do we incorporate AM on spare parts?
Okay. With respect to obsolescence, in fact, what we were just talking about in predictive actions, let's talk about that example when we're talking about a piece of equipment that we've got operating and it's working okay, but we can no longer buy spare parts for that. So it's obsolete and I can't buy spare parts even though it's still operating. Well, what we've got to look at is what's the failure rate of that item, and when are we going to get to the point where we just don't have the parts to maintain it, and make a judgment decision on when we're going to have to change out the kit to manage that. But so that's one aspect. The other part of asset management is that we need to continue to look at our assets to see which ones are adding value, which ones are not, and which ones should we be delisting from our asset register. So if it's obsolete and it's not working, then why do we still have it? If it's the other aspect of managing obsolescence is putting into your asset management plan, these are the conditions of the items that we have, and these are the things that are affecting us. And thus, every time we're dealing with obsolescence, at some point in time, we're going to have to replace that asset. And that's going to mean money in the budget. That's going to need a project. That's going to need some decisions about how we're going to do it. So build management of obsolescence. First of all, define what you're going to do in your strategic asset management plan, and then build your plans into your asset management plan so that you can see where it is that you're going to need to spend some money, and that money related to obsolescence. But it's a critical issue to many of us who are running plant that is older. Yeah. Oh, now the other part. Can you remind me of the other part of the question? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, how do we incorporate asset management on spare parts?
Oh, okay. So asset management requires a careful decision making around our maintenance program. And as we're designing the maintenance program and we're using tools like reliability-centered maintenance, criticality analysis, all of these processes, what comes out of that is these are the spare parts that we need. And not only once we've defined the spare parts that we need out of that process, we then need to maintain our spare parts. We need to stock them, we need to look after them. And it's not just a case of putting them on the shelf. Some spare parts need to, they might have moving parts that need to be rotated. They might need particular environments. But the management of spare parts is very much part of your whole maintenance program, and it feeds into your reliability and your service levels. So here's an encouragement. Remember, we were talking about some time ago the value that we get from our assets, and I talked about service levels. If you've defined the service level you need from a particular piece of equipment, and you know that to achieve that service level, which will include a certain level of availability and reliability, to achieve those availability and reliability, you need these parts. Then you need to get those parts and look after them. And you need to describe why you need those parts and why you need the money and to both acquire them and look after them in terms of the value that they provide in terms of your service level and availability and reliability and so on. So I don't see management of spares as anything different to the management of your operating equipment. Your operating equipment is there in the process of providing value, but part of your service level is having it reliable and available. Part of that is having the right spares. So it's all part of the same service level. It's all part of the same discussion. It's integral to providing that service level. Kids keep thinking back to, why do I need this bit of equipment? What's the service it provides? What's the service level? What's the value it provides to my organization? And use that to define what you need by way of critical spares. You cannot separate your spares, and particularly your critical spares, from the asset, the actual operating asset, in terms of the value. I don't know whether that answered your questions, but I see it as one and the same. Critical
So,
spares need to be maintained. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, if can you give us a thumbs up, sir? If that's good. You're good with that. We do have more questions. Actually, I'm not sure if it's connected to the previous question, but I'm just going to go read accordingly from or chronologically from this. So the next question is, what is the distinction between planning of changes in clause 6 and control of change in clause 8?
Sorry, the difference between planning?
Planning of changes in clause 6 and control of change in clause 8.
All right. So the planning for change is all about doing the risk assessments. Who do we need to communicate to? How do we get this done? It's putting a plan in place. The control of change is the execution of that change. So if we're talking about a piece of equipment, the planning of the change is about what are we going to replace it with? When are we going to replace it? What's the scope of it? What drawings do we need to update? What people do we need to train in how to operate this new piece of equipment? All of that happens in the planning phase. Then when we get to the execution is when we actually go in and start changing that piece of equipment out. And we've got to control that. We've got to manage it as we take the old equipment out and put the new equipment in. We do that physically. But then we've got to make sure that all of our drawings get updated. We've got to make sure our procedures are updated. We've got to make sure that our training for our personnel is completed so that people know how to use the new piece of kit. All of that is in the control area. Getting ready in the planning clause, making sure it's done right in the control phase. I hope that answered the question.
That's good. So we can move to the next. If there are still any clarifications on this particular questions, you can later on you can message us erudite for it, and we can connect you with Philip. after the webinar. So the next one is, what is the most effective way to identify gaps in data collection, analysis, or decision making that could hinder the timely identification of risks, and evaluate if these align with the standard's emphasis on proactive asset management?
That is a very big question. Again, this is strongly dependent on the context of the organization and the situation you're in and what you're doing. It should come out of, if you start to do an analysis of what your key risks are, and you start to do an analysis of in particular, let's talk about physical assets now for a moment. If we're talking about physical assets and we're going through and we're doing our maintenance programs, design, we're trying to define the value that we're getting from our asset. As you're trying to make those decisions and those risk management decisions, you will very quickly find whether you have enough data to support and answer the questions that you have when you're doing that risk assessment, or whether you don't have the data. And so it's going through the process that's going to identify that. I think there are also some blanket statements that you need to understand. You need to know what assets you have, right? So if you don't know what assets you have, or they're not listed on your asset register, that's the starting point. Define how granular, how deep into the equipment you're going to get, and start putting them there. And when you start to think about how we're going to maintain that, you'll very quickly understand whether you have the data to make the decisions or you don't have the data to make the decisions. It's very hard for me to give a blanket statement about that. It depends on your context and your organization. I really wish I could get more detailed, but we'd actually have to look at your situation and provide more guidance with more knowledge on your detail. And I'm sorry, we don't have scope to get into that in this discussion. But a great question. That's a big question. And it's a question that many organizations, when they start with asset management, truly grapple with. So you're not alone in that.
All right, so we do have a lot of questions. We're just going to finish this up until Sir Gillier and proceed, since we still have a few slides. Am I right, Sir Phil?
Yes, we do have some to get through. Yes.
Okay, so just a few more, just to finish up the ones on the chat section. So from Sir Adrian, small companies have always faced challenges in adopting standards like ISO 55001 due to limited financial resources, lack of technical expertise, and difficulty balancing operational priorities with strategic goals. How do you think this update encourages them to prioritize long-term goals alongside short-term objectives?
It doesn't make a big difference. The updates, the 2024 updates, don't make a big difference, except for saying that there is a little bit more emphasis on the life cycle and encouraging you to take some time out, encouraging you and your organization to think a little bit more long term may help guide the decision and guide getting more resources to focus on implementation on systems that will deliver value over the long term. Apart from that long-term focus, the ISO standard updates in 2024 don't have a significant impact on how to manage that burden between the day-to-day and the improvement. That balancing between executing work and if you know the 7 habits, sharpening the saw, getting better, that balance is a difficult one. And basically, it's important that you get leadership commitment to putting some time, some resources on a regular basis into development and improvement of systems and standards and processes to overall deliver value, long-term value to the business. Challenge between short-term and long-term never goes away. Even in big organizations, it never goes away, but it's particularly, I agree, prevalent in smaller, lower budgeted organizations. Absolutely.
All right. So the next one, so last two questions. How to get the process disposal asset clear and clean?
The process for disposal of assets. Get your decision making signed off by senior management around here's how we make decisions about what's going to be disposed of. The criteria, the route, who signs off to say we're going to dispose of this asset, or as I've heard just today, we were talking about it in another training class. We don't want to call it disposal anymore. We want to call it repurposing. Doesn't really matter what you call it. But so have your guidelines defined, get them signed off by management, including who's the signature to say this is ready to go. Have that process defined, and then execute the process and insist that people stick to the process so that it's clean. I have seen people really struggle with disposal because nobody wants to make a final decision, or everybody's scared. So you've got to get your decision-making criteria clear, get it signed off by senior management, get the right signature on the bit of paper to say it's got to go, and make it happen.
All right. So last one, although I'm not so sure if this is connected or related to the previous question. How does your organization ensure alignment between its asset management objectives and overall business goals?
That is an absolute 100% requirement of the asset management system. First of all, make sure that people involved in asset management really understand the overall objectives and goals of the organization. And that means they've got to ask the right people. The organization, you should ask the asset management folks need to ask the organization, please clearly document what the value you provide. Please document what your objectives are. Please document where you're going. So you've got to get the overall organization purpose and objectives documented and clear. You've got to understand the context and who your stakeholders are and who you're serving. Write it down. Write it down clearly, get that written, and then make sure everybody in your asset management team is laser focused on the reason that they exist. And the reason that the assets exist is to support the organizational objectives. And then you say, right, how are we going to sort those assets and work the assets to support the organizational objectives? Make sure the organizational objectives and goals and principles and purpose is clear, documented, and then disseminate it widely, and then get your asset management people, your maintenance people, your operations people, your asset managers, get them together and say, right, this is what we have to do. We need to make our asset management system support our organizational objectives. Start by making sure your organizational objectives are crystal clear, written down, and distributed and well understood throughout the organization so that they start to guide everything that happens in asset management.
All right. So thanks, Phil, for answering these questions, and thank you everyone for jotting them down. So keep doing it. Keep taking notes of your questions for later, so we can address them later. All right. So with that, I guess we can go ahead, Sir Phil, with the next part of your presentation.
Okay. This is the last little bit. It's not so little, but we're now going to talk about the Global Forum in Maintenance and Asset Management, their asset management landscape updates. Just a reminder, the Global Forum is a non-profit organisation which is supported by non-profit organisations from around the globe. Here in Australia, where I'm speaking from, the Asset Management Council is a member, and there's many other members around the world, as I'm sure people know, but just wanted to remind people of that. The team that developed the ISO standards come from the same pool of volunteers and people working closely together with the people who updated the landscape. The landscape and the standards are really closely integrated, and they feed off one another and they supplement one another. You need to have both the landscape and the standards to really implement good asset management system. So let's first look at, here's the topic headings. If I get my cursor, here's the topic headings that were in version 2 of the landscape: strategy and planning, decision-making, life cycle delivery, asset information, organisation, people, risk and review. So those were the headings of the 6 areas. We've now, as you can see there, got 7 areas, and they've been laid out a little bit more similarly to the standard, not precisely the same as the standard, but you can see here that it starts with context and stakeholders, just like the standard does. It's got this new thing on governance, then it's got a clause on planning, a clause on leadership and people, clause, I keep saying clause, a subject group on data information, a subject group on delivery, and then a new subject group on value realization. And you can see the text below these that describe them all. If you get yourself a free copy of the Global Forums landscape from the Global Forums website, which I've got a link to in this, this presentation a little bit later, you will be able to see these and read these at your leisure. Within all of these landscapes, here's all of the subjects. You'll notice that the subjects have been renumbered, so now you can immediately see by the first number which subject group they are in. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 are all in one for context, and so on it goes through the list there. Now, in terms of what has changed, let's look at a few different ways. The first thing I'll just point out to you is, in this version, the items that are in bold down the bottom here relate directly to the ISO standard, and the items that are in italics do not relate directly to a clause in the standard. So you can see that about half of the subjects in the landscape tie directly back to the ISO clauses, but not all of them do. Half of them don't. But those half that don't are still required if you're doing maturity assessments, if you're looking for asset management certification, you need to understand the topics in the landscape and the clauses in the ISO standard. This picture shows the changes. These items in green, there's 6 of them, they have been added. All right, so these are new clauses or new subjects in the landscape version 3 versus landscape version 2. Over here on the left here, capital investment decision-making and operations and maintenance decision-making, they have been merged now, and they're both in this one here, 3.5, decision-making. What has been removed from version 2 are these ones here, but if you look at the planning area, you'll find that they're well covered. For instance, strategic planning is well covered in strategy and objectives. Resource management is well covered in resourcing strategy and management here in 3.7. Shutdown outage management is covered in this one, shutdown strategy and planning. And AM system monitoring has been included up here in 7.2 monitoring. So although these have been removed as subjects, they still do appear in the landscape somewhere. So these are the changes that have been made to the landscape, and I'm going to do what I did last time. I'll use this little picture as a way of stepping through some of the more significant changes. So if we look at organizational purpose and context, it's a new subject that aligns with ISO 55001. And it talks about the factors that might influence an organization's purpose and context. And you can see the sorts of things listed there. I won't read them to you. And it's a lot of focus on what I've just been talking about in answering one of the questions. The approach and the scope and the boundaries for the asset management system should be 100% driven by and 100% aligned with the organization's purpose and objectives. in every area, the strategic planning, the risk management, regulatory compliance, frameworks for governance, etc. So we really want to make sure that every part of our asset management system is subservient to and supportive of our organisation's purpose and context. The next subject area is this asset management system. There used to be one sentence in the 2014 version of the standard, and that has now been expanded upon. It's similar to the ISO definition for the standard. It talks about how important it is to integrate the asset management system with, as we were talking about before, the quality management system, the safety management system, the risk management system, the controls integrity management system. All of these management systems should be integrated together. And the characteristics of the asset management system are described, the integrated set of tools, the holistic approach, and making sure that it's monitored for alignment with what the organisation really needs. All right, moving on from that. I'm also keeping my eye on the time. We're getting close to our time limit here. I'm not going to say too much about decision making. You can see here that we've taken these ones out and we put them into 3.5. There is a couple of things about decision making I need to say. One is that the reason that we have our decision making guidelines is to continue to get that desired balance of our cost, risk, opportunity, and performance over the life cycle. The other point I really quickly want to make is that the scope of asset management decision goes from right at the beginning, the strategic in terms of asset creation and acquisition, through to how we maintain it and refurbish and replace it, down to our operations and maintenance strategies and actions. So the scope of asset management decision making is from the top to the bottom of asset management. And we're trying to continue to get that desired balance of cost, risk, opportunity, and performance. Management of change. I'm going to talk about 3 topics at the same time. Management of change here in governance, organisational change management here in leadership and people, and configuration management over in data and information. And I've lumped these together because in my mind, they are all change management. So this first section on management of change is it aligns with those 2 clauses that we were looking at in ISO 55001 about planning change and control of change. The organisational change management is new. And what it is it's recognising the significant impact that asset management system implementation has on an organisation, and more particularly has on the people within the organisation, and how we need to bring those people along in our change management and continuous improvement journeys. How do we structure the changes? How do we govern it? How do we make sure that we have looked at the human impacts of change and we're supporting people through that change? So that's a new area with a significant focus. And this last area is on configuration management, which is similar to what it was before. It's about keeping what we think we have the same as what we actually have. So what's the information we have about our assets is in line with what we actually have installed and what we're actually using to deliver value. That's called configuration management, and it's alive because as we change our assets, we need to continually change our description of our assets that we have in whatever models we've got in our CMMS, our computerized maintenance management system, in our various information systems and so on our drawings and our procedures. We've got to keep them up to date. So you can see now that change management covers the technical aspects of change, it covers the people side of change, and it covers the data and information side of change. Lastly, and I'm speeding up now because, again, the time is drawing to a close, but this last section on value realisation has this is a new clause on outcomes and impacts, and is about you continuing to watch how you're doing with your asset management activities and continue to make sure that they add value. Monitoring is similar to ISO 55001-24 clause 9.1, and it's that broad range of activities to review and evaluate your data and information value indicators through the life cycle. And lastly, continuous improvement is a new subject that expands on clause 10.1 in the ISO standard about analysing performance, identifying opportunities, and driving those improvements to increase value. That brings me to an end of that section. So let me just again see if there's any questions, or whether we want to move straight on to talking a little bit about Certified Asset Management 2. I'll be guided by you.
Yep, so do we have any more questions regarding that? Of GFMEM of Asset Management Landscape Updates. This is also an open mic, so if anyone who would want to go ahead and ask their questions, you can do so by opening your mics. This would be our last question and answer session, right, Sir Phil? So anything goes, like even for the whole cover of the presentation, they can ask questions about those.
Yes.
So from Sir Ruben, so could this data management will transpire to AI?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Could this data management be transpired to AI?
So AI, I'm sure, will become a big part of data management. You can't give it away. In fact, I was just talking to an educational organisation here in Australia today, and they are looking at how they're going to use AI in terms of managing their data, and they realized the first thing they needed to do was make sure that they had their data in appropriate standardized format to allow and to enable AI to do its work. So there's all sorts of neat things you can do with AI, but you've got to start with good data, because you apply artificial intelligence to bad data, results, just like people will. So you've got to make sure that you've got the format and quality of your data right before you let AI loose on it. But yes, it will help. Yes, there's no question that AI will play a big part in how we manage our data going forward, but start from a good base. Don't think it's going to fix your problems in data. If you've got inaccurate data or incomplete data, AI will not fix that for you.
Okay, so next question for Sir Osman. So will the deck be shared? So I'm just going to go ahead and answer that. We will be sharing a copy of Sir Phil's presentation later on. So the team will be sending you an email afterwards. Can you share any other resource to better understand changes from ISO 55001-2014 to ISO 55001-2024?
I think if you go through this pack, when you get the pack after the presentation is over, if you go back through that pack and you have a copy of the standard open in front of you and a copy of the landscape open in front of you, there's no better way to do it than use that. I've gone through and I've found all of the key changes, and they are listed in that pack. So then it's just a case of reminding yourself, go through the pack, and that's it. This is a complete picture of the changes that have been made from 2014 to 2024. In fact, World Partners have recognised this pack as being sufficient to update from CAMA to CAMA 2. So they recognise that it provides the information that's required to understand the changes.
Okay, and thank you, sir, for the question. So what reference would you recommend for us to get standard KPIs covering the areas of asset management? KPI that would help us get to ISO certification.
I'm not sure that I'm in a position to answer that. I think that's a case of I think somebody who understands your business and who understands asset management you need to ask somebody who both. I understand asset management, but I don't understand your business because I don't know what your business is, and I would need to do so before even trying to answer that question. I'm sorry. Because you've got to understand your service level, your value proposition, because that is what helps that's what helps you work out what your KPIs you need. Yep. Sorry, I couldn't be more help.
Yeah. All right. Is there any other questions before we check out on the new camera certification? All right. So if there is none, we can always, you can always send us a message at Erudite if you ever come think of anything else, and we will make sure to deliver those questions and coordinate with Phil. So yeah, Phil, you still have something to share regarding the certification.
I'll just show one slide here. So World Partners, if you've got a CAMA certificate already and you want to upgrade to CAMA 2, there's a quiz that you can go onto the World Partners in Asset Management website. Now that you've sat through this training, you will know the answers to the quiz. You'll be able to complete that quiz, and if you get it right, you'll get a new CAMA 2 certificate. That's the quickest way to do it. If you want to get the standards, you can find them at this link. And as I said before, if you want a copy of the latest version of the landscape, you can see them at this link here. So you'll get those links on the pack. So that, I think, brings us to an end.
All right. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We do have a few announcements or announcements to make, if that's all right. So we're going to send out later a post-evaluation form for those who will be needing a certificate of participation. You can input the actual names you would like to put on the certificate on that post-evaluation form. So we will be sending that to you later. You will also receive a copy of Phil's presentation deck on PDF format, as well as the recording of this webinar in case you've missed out some of the items Phil covered or discussed. So some few more announcements, Sir Phil, if I can just grab the screen from you.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yep.
Bear with me. There you go.
That's good. All right. So yeah, okay. Before that, first is in accordance with this webinar, we actually have a scheduled public training on March on risk and asset management review, understanding the ISO 31000 and 55000 with Phil. It's going to be on March 5th to 7th. So if you would like to join in on this 3-day training, go ahead and message the team, inquire about that trading. And then on January 22nd of January, it's going to be our next webinar with Sir Rafik this time. So it's about utility scale solar PV systems, understanding performance drivers and factors influencing performance degradation. So if you want to go ahead and join in, it's totally free on January 22. You can scan this QR code and register just the same as how you registered in this webinar. So we're planning to have a quarterly webinar in Erudite. So we hope to see you there. Thank you for joining us today, actually. And then the APM Lead Conference and Exhibition 2025 is on the way. Our super early bird promo of 25% for the full 3-day registration is until January 17th. So make sure to get your tickets with the best deal. If you are someone who would like to, who considers presenting on the conference, on the 3-day conference, you can also message us in Erudite. Okay, so that's also for further any more updates on our upcoming webinars, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter, our email newsletter, and follow us or connect with us on our social media pages. We have our LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as mentioned by Ms. Rain earlier, all of our previews and this webinar will be posted or is posted on our YouTube channel. You can go visit us there as well. Right. And last but not the least, Sir Phil, we want to thank you and offer this small token of appreciation for delivering this webinar. So let me just read this certificate of appreciation. This certificate is awarded to Philip Sunderland, or Phil, in recognition of his outstanding contribution as a speaker in the Asset Management Standards and Landscapes 2024 Updates webinar. His dedication, expertise, and commitment to the task at hand were instrumental in ensuring the success of the event. Given this 4th day of December of 2024, signed by the President of Erudite Reliability Services, OPC, Erwin Bernat. So once again, thank you, Phil, for
And thank you very
joining
much
us.
for having me. I really appreciate what Erudite's doing and this recognition. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
So let's give Phil a round of applause, a virtual round of applause, if it may. Yeah. And thank you everyone really for joining us. So for us, this is already a big round. So if you do have any other questions, don't hesitate or feel free to message us on any of our pages or contact the team that have sent you this invite. All right, so one last request, actually, if we can do a photo op with our with Phil and our participants, just to commemorate this moment. So I am requesting if you guys can open your cameras. And I'm also requesting the help of the team to take screenshots. All right. So hold your smile. Ayan. So nagkakakitaan na tayo. Meron pa po palang mga nasa biyahe. Thank you so much. Someone's still outside on a ride. So thank you for joining us and be safe on the road. All right. So can we do the photo again? So 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay, team. Yeah. One more. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And once again, this is our last for the year. See you again next year. And keep updated of our upcoming events.